when people disagree on racism, if they're like disagreeing with someone's sort of right to exist, is that still a disagreement that we should be able to tolerate?
To actually answer that question properly, I would need to know what people mean when they say right to exist, because it seems like no one ever really says, no one ever really explains what they actually mean. Because here's the thing, if you say to someone, you're disagreeing with my right to exist, that's very loaded. That's a very, very loaded thing to say.
That was Africa Brooke, and you are listening to Sinta with Soytheist. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Soytheist.
Welcome to another episode of Sinta with Soytheist. Sinta is the Assamese word for thinking. Today, I'm joined by Africa Brooke. So, Africa, first of all, thanks for being here.
Thank you. This has been a long time coming, and I was mentioning to you before we started recording that I had actually invited you to be a guest on my podcast about a year, last summer perhaps, and that conversation never ended up going out into the world, along with many other conversations, because they just didn't feel as if I got the best out of the people that I was speaking with. And since then, I've had the most incredible dialogue with those people, and now that I get to have it with you on your podcast is an absolute joy. So thank you for having me.
Right. The honor is all mine. So, Africa, before we begin, for those who might not know you, could you briefly introduce yourself? Who is Africa Brooke, basically?
Yes. So I am a Zimbabwean-born consultant, writer, and coach, and I live here in London, in England. And what I do in terms of my work as a coach and as a consultant, I help people that are struggling with self-sabotage and self-censorship. So I mainly work one-to-one with people that are in the public eye, but I also work with organizations. I work with different teams. I also work with just different individuals. I do a lot of speaking around the UK, but also internationally, whether that's virtual or in person. But my main work is to really understand what is at the core of why people get in their own way, which is what self-sabotage means. And about 2 years ago, my direction with that, which has been what I've been researching, studying, and working on for the past 5 to 6 years, past couple of years ago, it moved from me just looking at what happens on the individual level to looking at what happens on the collective level, which is going to be, I guess, a big part of our conversation today. But my two pillars that I focus on in my work are self-sabotage and self-censorship.
Right. I do want to get into all of that with you.
Yes.
But before we begin, I'd just like to sort of run a disclaimer. So you and I, we agree on a lot of things as far as I can tell. So to ensure that we're not just sitting here having a good time, I'll be playing the devil's advocate on a lot of issues.
Okay.
And on
Good.
other issues where we disagree, I'll just be the devil, so to speak. And hopefully you won't be able to tell the difference.
Okay. I like that. I like that.
Yeah. So I think a good place to start would be like at the point at which we discovered sort of each other's discovered each other, right? Basically what we're saying. So the way I discovered you, before that, right? So I had been like frustrated with identity politics for a very long time, right? I would see it going all around, and especially in my country, like identity politics has like torn this country apart. Right?
Really?
So I have been frustrated. Right, I have been frustrated with this for a very long time, but I had never quite spoken about it. Right, it's always been something I had been privately frustrated with, and it was not until November 2020 that I first started speaking about it. And I think you'll find it very interesting why I started speaking about it, but that's for later. But then, like coincidentally, I found your letter, right? Which was titled, somewhat provocatively, "Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness," right? So I just want to know, like, what caused you to write this letter?
Mm. I mean, I don't know the full details of what your exact frustrations around identity politics were, but I think that's a very concise way to put it in terms of what I also felt. I was starting to feel very fed up. I was starting to feel that there's something really wrong going on here, but I don't have the language for it. And you know what? Identity politics is not even a term that I would have used to describe. I wouldn't have used that term in association with the frustration that I felt. It was just visceral. It was very physical. It was just me going onto social media or having conversations with the people that, I was associated with. And it would usually play out in the same way all the time, whether the subjects were about race or about gender or about sex or about class. It would always end up in the very same way, in a very divisive sort of way, in a script-like way, where people will parrot the exact same thing that I've seen on social media somewhere. So it was sort of a collection of incidents that had been happening from, I would say, about 2017 onwards. And all of these things were amplified by everything that happened in the summer of 2020, be it, the George Floyd incident in the US that then started a lot of conversations, including a lot of important conversations, actually, in the Anglosphere. But what led me to write that letter, why I'm leaving the cult of wokeness, is because the cult-like dynamics of these echo chambers and social justice spaces did start to take a toll on me mentally, but also very much physically, with the anxiety that came with having some of these conversations. So when someone asked me that question, what led to you writing that letter, there's no one incident that I can sort of point to. It was a collection of incidents over many years, but I felt as though I couldn't talk about it. And as someone that has been looking at self-sabotage and understands the patterns of self-sabotage and understands that self-censorship is a form of self-sabotage, I knew that despite the comfort, I just need to fucking say what is happening here, what I am seeing. And I think part of the letter's success, because now it's been read by 5 million people and more, part of the letter's success as well is that I wasn't telling anyone what to do. This wasn't an academic sort of paper. This wasn't an objective perspective saying this is how these people are behaving and this is what you should do. It wasn't directional in any kind of way. It was just a very subjective experience of what I am seeing happening, how I have also played a part in that culture, whether you want to call it cancel culture or the culture war. And I prefer to call it collective sabotage because I think it's a group effort to get in our own way. So I prefer the more precise language to describe it. I talked about the things that I also participated in, how insufferable I also was at a point in time because of identity politics. But my letter was me opting out. Pretty much, to put it in the most simplest way, it was me opting out of whatever the fuck was happening around me and what I was seeing. Yeah.
Right. That's very interesting. So a big part of your letter, I suppose, was this about talking about this kind of woke social justice, right? Where you're not allowed to question anything, where people will, as you've said, people will repeat the same things that they have heard over and over again. But you do say within your letter, if I remember correctly, that you do stand for genuine human rights efforts.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you understand like which part is like genuine social justice? How can you tell these two apart in your view?
Right. Okay. That's a very, very good question. I would say, and again, because most things are pretty much subjective, right? From the moment that I say genuine social justice or genuine oppression, it's immediately subjective. It's me, trying to filter it in the way that I see it. But for me, social justice that I can get behind doesn't feel like a performance. It doesn't feel like a performance, and it doesn't involve shaming and guilting people to get the support. But here's the thing, even when I say that, I think maybe there can be instances where, for example, if it's a government, maybe there can be instances where we shame and guilt the people that are in power so that they can change a law, so that they can, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about just everyday people that are being guilted and shamed, mainly because of their skin color, a lot of the time, mainly because of their skin color, so they can get behind something, or so they can shift their focus onto the thing that people have decided is the most important, to the point where it just starts to feel ritualistic almost, and it starts to feel like a performance, and there's never really any change. There's never really any, none of it is cohesive. None of it actually makes sense. The behavior goes against the goals that the people say they want. So to me, the social justice that I can really truly get behind doesn't feel like a performance, and it doesn't feel like it's ego driven, which is a lot of what I do see. But I think that's a question that I actually do really need to sit with, because I think it's one that I can answer intuitively, but I've never really articulated it in the way that I just have. But yeah, that's at this moment in time, that's the way that I would put it. That's the way
Like you know it when you see it, kind of.
I know it when I see it, and it doesn't feel like a performance, and it doesn't feel ego driven, and shame and guilt are not usually the default tactics that are used for people to get behind and support something. Yeah. And I'd be interested to know what you think as well, how you sort of differentiate between the two.
I think genuine social justice is social justice that you can question. Right? So like, I'm not so much very concerned about like shaming people or guilt tripping people, because I suppose there's going to be a difference in perception because of where we're located, maybe. Because I suppose in my country there are genuine, I don't know how it is really in the Western world, because I have the politics of my own country to be concerned with.
Yeah.
But there are, I think, very genuine efforts, like genuine issues that I think people should stop contributing to. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that that's another difference. I think the kind of social justice that I wouldn't get behind asks people to be activists. Right. Where on the other hand, the kind of social justice that I would get behind, and maybe even be an advocate for myself, is the kind that does not ask people to be advocates, but just ask them to be like not stop contributing to a problem. So it's like if someone is advocating for non-racism instead of being anti-racism, like being anti-racist, I think that's the kind of stuff that I would get behind. If I can definitely go around asking people, you should not be racist, but I'm definitely never going to going around asking people that you should be anti-racist, you should dedicate your time to this. And I think that's the difference that I see between the two. Like, what is your take on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very beautiful and precise way to put that forward. And I completely agree with you. I completely agree. And I think there is that difference, right? It's the should part that I think there's also a lot of entitlement around that, because something that I'm always thinking about is who gets to decide that this is the issue that everyone needs to be focusing on? Who gets to decide that? Because there are billions of people. There are so many different things that are happening in people's lives. And here's the thing, whether it's in the West or elsewhere, for the most part, the average person is just trying to make things work. They're just trying to keep their four walls in place. They're just trying to feed themselves, their children. They're trying to figure out where the money is coming from next month. Do they even have enough money for next week? If I think of back home in Zimbabwe, and I think of teachers who have been protesting for maybe the past 2 years, especially to get paid, teachers are getting paid as little as $30 a month. $30 a month. And they're not being paid at all. So when I think of some of these things that are really being put forward, especially here in the West as if they are the most important things that everyone needs to be talking about. And if you're not talking about this, if you're not standing behind this, then you are a bigot, then you are so and so. But who gets to decide that this is the most important? So yeah, I think it's the should part that actually turns a lot of people away from social justice, which I think should not be the goal. We should care. We should care, right? But I think the approach of most people, especially most Western people that live quite comfortable lives, their approach and the demand for perfection and for every single individual to participate in what they deem important is actually turning people away. It's having the complete reverse effect. And it's because of that should, as you say, that you should be an activist. If you're a good person, then you should.
Yeah. I think if you're like a good person, all that you have to do is like you should not contribute to unnecessary suffering.
Yes.
That's all.
Yes. Yes.
So I think like because we're in the middle of all of these culture wars, sort of, there is this sort of polarization, and I'm seeing it like everywhere I see it, it's there. Right? So when your letter is titled like "Why I'm Leaving the Cult of Wokeness," so when you left that sort of cult, how did you manage to not land up in another echo chamber? Because there's definitely another echo chamber on the other side. I don't want to name any names, but there is a very prominent person on the sort of other side of the spectrum. Like they're big, like they've been on the Joe Rogan Experience, and they're like, I think they tweeted out at one point that like we spend too much time. I'm paraphrasing. They said we spend too much time like asking for woke activists to not do these things, when instead they should be begging us to not put them in prisons, which is just, I think, ridiculous. So there's this one.
Goodness.
And I can tell you later, but I don't want to mention their name. I don't want to mention their name now.
Sure.
So there is this another echo chamber, and it exists on a multitude of different issues, right? Because they all think alike on that side too. But there's this one particular issue, right, where they're just like the sort of, it's such a funny word. They behave just like the woke people that they claim to hate. But again, we'll discuss that later. But I do want to know how you managed to not land up in another echo chamber, because I do see you as a very sort of nuanced person who is not in, at least as it seems to me.
Thank you. And you know what? I'm glad you bring this up. And this is going to be so important for the people listening or anyone that is also on their own journey, because this happens so easily and so often. And it's something that I talk about quite a bit now, because in the past year, I've noticed it more than ever. And because just in my work around self-sabotage and really just being curious about how patterns work in general and how human beings will find tribes wherever they go, and how belonging is very important. And all of these other aspects of just psychology and sociology as well. It's something that I noticed instantly. That you will have people that it's usually something along the lines of leaving the left, and then they become the exact same thing but just on the right. It's pretty hilarious when I see it sometimes. And there are some people that I found at that time who had quote unquote left the left, which I never did, by the way. I never left the left, because I was never part of the left. I've always been, and maybe me being an immigrant here in me being an immigrant in the UK and my family being very much Zimbabwean, we don't over-identify with any political party or political leaning. It's just not a thing. And in most Black communities actually here in London, but I would say as far as England, there's no over-identification with a political party or a political leaning. Not at all. It's not really a thing. But a lot of us, including myself, will tend to be left-leaning for most things, especially when it comes to socially left-leaning. But because most of us are from very religious households, we tend to be very conservative people as well. So it's usually a dance between, I would say, between the two, kind of in the middle of the political spectrum. So I never left the left to go anywhere. I just declared that I'm not playing whatever this game is. But I do see that dynamic quite a lot. And to me, it's just self-righteousness. It's self-righteousness. And from the very beginning, even when I wrote my letter, I was very adamant about the fact that this is not me, as you're saying, leaving one echo chamber and going straight into another one, because it's the exact same framework. It's the exact same behavior, just dressed up as something different. And at that time, there are some people that I found, this is where my thought was going. There are some people that I found that were, declaring that they're leaving the left, etc. And they were very important voices for me, actually, at that time, because I needed to hear something different. I was yearning for something different. I was looking for people that were going against, how you should think, how you should speak. And I found it to be very refreshing. But then over time, as I continued to listen to certain people, I just started to recognize the same kind of patterns, the same kind of dismissive language, the same egoic language. People are sheep, the referring to people as the woke, etc., etc., etc. And here's the thing. I think the term woke, there's a time and a place for it. I'm not saying that people should stop using it. You can say whatever the fuck you want. It's just when we just throw it in, it's almost in the same way as people that are far left will call everyone alt-right. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. When there's no argument, when there's nothing useful to add to the conversation, when they know that it's going to evoke a certain reaction in people, some people will do it for a following, because maybe when they left the left, they started to realize, oh, okay, there's really something in this fucking message. Let me just beat the drum a little bit more. You see people start to do that, and then they sort of regurgitate the message over and over again. But now they sort of have to go to the extreme because they're running out of things, and it becomes their character. But how I have really stayed away from that is because even in my own personal life, I'm not a clique type of person. I'm someone that really sort of sits in solitude a lot of the time. I like my own space. I have a small group of friends outside of the internet who I have real conversations with. I have wonderful people that I've connected with online, people who are in integrity, people that have no desire to feed the culture war, people that genuinely want to understand what is happening. And I also think, because I'm approaching all of this from a lens of really just wanting to understand the psychology behind all of this, not the name calling part or trying to pick a side and be with the cool kids. I couldn't give a shit about any of that. I just want to know what the hell is happening here, which is why my angle of focusing on self-censorship and self-sabotage, I think that's what actually keeps me grounded, because I'm not trying to chase social points by hopping onto the latest sort of social issue or, ranting about how woke every single person is and labeling every single thing as woke, because it's not woke to care about progress. It's not. It's not. I wonder, actually, and this is a question for you a little bit later, with the advocacy that you do around veganism, I'm sure there are some people that will call you woke, etc., but it's not woke to care. It's not. It's just sensible, and it's reasonable, and it's putting ideas out and trying to get people to engage in a conversation. So I think the temptation to hop from one echo chamber straight into another is very real, but it's usually because people are just not being in integrity with themselves. They're seeking external validation more than they are actual truth and uniting people and trying to add something useful to the conversation. But I see it all the time. I see it all the time. Even with people that I used to actually respect, I see it all the time. And I think it allows me to just kind of focus on my work and the bigger picture and what I'm doing.
That's interesting. So
what about you?
Oh, for sure. So the way I do it is I speak on multiple niches, right? So multiple non-overlapping niches. So when I do that, right, if I'm going so because I'm in two different niches that just don't overlap, You see, like if I'm going like to what it's a funny word, I can't say it without laughing, but if I'm going to woke, right, then I'm going to get a sort of feedback from this side that says, you know what, I think you've gotten that wrong, maybe, right? So, and if I'm like going to sort of anti-woke, I get the feedback from the other side, which says like, you know,
Right.
you maybe you've gotten this wrong, maybe you're getting too stuck on this. So
Yeah.
I think that's a good balance. I think, yeah. So, and I do think that can really help. And if someone wants to avoid echo chambers, I do think this is a good way.
Oh yeah,
So,
for sure.
right. And you know, when another thing that I've come across, right, when we're sort of discussing ideas, right, on the point of discussing ideas, like there's this viral tweet sort of that everyone repeats, that when we say, you know, we can disagree and still be friends, people say things like, you know, disagreement is for pizza toppings.
I knew that was the one you were talking about. I hate that one so much.
Disagreement is for pizza toppings. It's not for things like, and it's not for serious issues. So, like, what is your take on that? Like, what's your reaction to that, basically?
I think that's probably one of the most. That's not an argument. That's not an argument at all. We need to be able to. Here's the thing. Disagreement is always going to exist, whether it's a light topic, whether you are at the table trying to decide what fucking pizza you're going to order, or whether there's a mandate that's happening in your country, which is a very real thing that's happening all over the world. Is the COVID passport mandate a good thing, or is it a bad thing? Is it that? Right? That's a discussion that there's a lot of agreement on, depending on what sides you're from and depending on where you sit politically, depending on what your own anecdotal experiences have been. Then there are many disagreements, right? Depending on the very same things. And they will exist whether or not we talk about them, right? So why we should be able to have the conversation so we can understand how people are arriving to their conclusions. We need to be able to have, because I think the idea of someone saying, well, we can have disagreements about this, but we can't, it comes with this, it speaks to that culture of safety where we just want to feel that everyone is reflecting our belief system, that everyone is on the exact same page as we are, because it allows us to feel safe, because otherwise we feel that there's a threat that's sort of there. And again, it's a very primal thing with human beings. We want to belong. We want to know that everyone is on the same page. There isn't an enemy here. But we're in the modern world, so it just presents itself in different ways. But ultimately, I think we've really just lost the ability to have healthy conflict, to have healthy disagreement, even when there are very difficult things that are on the table. But I do think I think, to me, it seems obvious, but I understand, because of how viral a tweet like that can go, that many people don't seem to understand that there's more of a benefit to being able to have these conversations, so we can see what the good ideas are, what the bad ideas are, so we can move all of the really terrible ideas from just running, amok underground, and have the conversations. So that's sort of my take on it. I don't think that's a useful argument to say that disagreement is about toppings and nothing else.
So here's a sort of steelman of that idea, right? Perhaps I should define what a steelman is. We all know what a straw man is, right? We know a straw man is when someone sort of misrepresents your argument to make it a weaker version, and then they're like fighting with the straw man. A steelman is the opposite of that. A steelman is when you take someone's argument, you take the strongest version of it, and then you try to refute it so that you have really refuted the idea. So the steelman of that is that, like, we can disagree and still be friends. Unless you disagree with my right to exist. This is another one that goes around.
Yes.
And I forget who it is attributed to, but I do know it is misattributed. perhaps. But anyway, that's the one that goes around. What do you have to say to that? Like when people disagree on racism, if they're like disagreeing with someone's sort of right to exist, is that still a disagreement that we should be able to tolerate?
To actually answer that question properly, I would need to know what people mean when they say right to exist, because it seems like no one ever really says, no one ever really explains what they actually mean. Because here's the thing, if you say to someone, you're disagreeing with my right to exist, that's very loaded. That's a very, very loaded thing to say. But as we've come to find out, especially in the past couple of years, people are using a lot of loaded language, but once you sort of open it up, it's empty and the person doesn't even know what they mean, right? So if you were to just, again, ask the question, what do you mean my right to exist? I think I would need to know what the individual even means to answer that question effectively. But I think it's usually used along the lines of, let's say there's a conversation happening around trans issues, which is, conversations that have been happening especially intensely for the past couple of years. And I understand why they're happening. I think conversations like that need to happen so people understand how they need to navigate in society. People can make sure that things are safeguarded, et cetera, et cetera. These conversations need to be happening so that we can make sure people that need protection the most are protected. The conversation needs to be happening. So one of the most common things that people have been talking about in terms of that is that children shouldn't be going on puberty blockers at such a young age, because it might be something that really damages them and is irreversible, and they need to be able to understand that fully. But if the brain is not developed properly at the age of 9, how do we navigate that situation? And a lot of people don't even want the conversation to be had, which I think is a really big problem when it's not about the contents of the conversation, but people not even wanting the conversation to happen to begin with. So usually you might have someone that's saying the conversation happening means that you don't want me to exist. You engaging in the conversation, that means you don't want me to exist. And no, that's not what that means at all. So again, I've heard but if you're disagreeing on my right to exist thing being put forward quite a lot, but to me it's so vague. It's so vague. I'll go as far as to say it doesn't actually mean anything, and no one seems to actually explain what it means exactly.
Right.
But it's very loaded. It's very loaded. So you have a lot of people hearing that instantly, or someone saying you're going against my right to exist, and people don't want to be ostracized. They don't want to be labeled a bigot. They don't want to be labeled whether it's transphobic, misogynistic, racist, white supremacist, etc. So they will just decide to not even have the conversation.
Interesting. So I'll give you an example, right? So recently there was this, again, I'm not the kind of person to name them, but maybe I should.
Yeah.
But anyway, there was this person who had who was banned off of Instagram. But they were pretty huge. They had like 150,000 followers or something like that.
Right.
After which they got banned. And recently they sort of came after me, and like since they had a problem with me, at one point they said that I am a dishonorable little puddle of curry, which is a racist insult, right?
What?
Yeah, I've kept screenshots. I think the post is still up, right? So that's one. That's kind of the extreme of what people might mean when they say disagree with someone's right to exist. Do you think that is a kind of opinion that should be allowed to be expressed? And before you answer, please don't worry about offending me, because I'm a very difficult person to offend. So. Do you think that is like? I'm not asking if you agree with that, because obviously don't.
Of course.
Do you think that is an opinion that should be allowed to be expressed?
I think yes. And I say that because if we don't allow for that opinion to be expressed, where does it end? Because it's not just going to be about that opinion. How many other opinions are we going to police? Right? Because if I think of, the person that called me when my open letter came out, the lovely person that decided to send me a DM and call me a bed wench for the white man, I, which I thought was actually quite creative and a bit hilarious. But they get to express that opinion. Here's the thing, whether I like it or not, they get to express that opinion, right? And it doesn't mean that I have to agree with it or disagree with it or take it as a part of myself, but they get to express that opinion. Because if we are going to police that, then again, exactly as I said, where does it end? Where does it end? How do we police people's opinions in that way? Ultimately, then I think more questions than answers come up, actually, when I explore this in my own mind. Is it ultimately just a game of personal responsibility where it's up to the individual to realize, actually, is it appropriate for me to send this to this person, or is it not appropriate for me to send it to this person? Because the policing aspect of it is what makes me extremely uncomfortable and is what makes me say, actually, yeah, that person gets to express that. You don't have to agree with it or disagree with it. Neither do I, but I don't have to take it as a part of myself either. But I really never want to entertain the idea of either the state stepping in or some kind of third party that monitors messages to see what people are saying to each other. That's not an option that I can entertain at all. So ultimately, I think a person gets to send that to me, and a person gets to send that to you. And yeah, that's kind of what's coming up right now. That's kind of what's coming up. But what do you think? How do you think a situation like that can be managed?
Like the way I responded to it was I sort of took that, I made a YouTube video out of it, and I made money off of it.
Good.
So this is something I've learned from Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
He does this a lot, where people I have a lot of disagreements with him. I don't think he's a terrible person, as some people do. I think he's wrong on a lot of issues, but this is something I think I can learn from him. Is that he sort of, he's on the other side of the political spectrum as me. So he says things like he has learned to monetize social justice warriors. So this is what I did. I took that lesson from him. But I think there's another approach that could be done, that people could take that and explain what's really wrong with this, right? I'm not the kind of person to do that, right? Because I think it's kind of boring, but someone could do that. And then people really know, because intuitively it seems wrong, right? This person is thinking of me as an inferior person because of the color of my skin. Wrong, obviously. But what's wrong with that? What's the first principle basis for what's wrong with that, right? So someone could explain that. And when you know that, right? When you know that, then you can apply that reasoning into other areas of the discussions that you're having, and you can you're more likely to arrive at correct conclusions. So I think that's another approach that could be done, but that's just not in my personality, I suppose.
Right.
But yeah.
Right.
So while we're discussing this issue of disagreement, at one point you shared this post where you said, if you here's the post. You said, quote, "If you can't clearly explain why you believe what you believe or why you take the position you take, you'll likely find it difficult to curiously engage with people who don't hold similar beliefs or opinions. You'll probably find yourself getting defensive when asked even the simplest follow-up questions." So I want to know what kind of experiences that you had that this. I'd imagine that this is not something that someone just writes randomly. So I just want to know what kind of issues have you experienced people getting so defensive on?
I can use myself very quickly as an example before I sort of touch on other people. But this was something that I experienced quite a lot. This was something that allowed me to see that, okay, I'm on shaky ground right now, and I seem to have all of this language, mainly sort of social justice like language. I would say this was around 2017 and 2018 mainly. But anytime someone asked me a question, my defenses would be up straight away, because I had associated people asking questions, especially in the context of social issues, etc. I had begun to associate that as they are trying to sort of out me in some kind of way, or they are doing it because they are a bigot, or they're doing it because they don't believe in this social stance that I take, which is the right one. So I just always saw questions as a threat, and I didn't even realize it, because I would have said, on a conscious level, I would have said, yeah, of course, I welcome questions. But anytime they came, because I was keeping myself in echo chambers with people that mainly agreed with me, with people that didn't really ask questions, because we were all on the same page, thinking the same thing, or so we thought. So I didn't really interact with people that thought that differently from me, even online. So anytime I would encounter someone that maybe just didn't really give a shit about social justice in the way that I did, or they just weren't online at all, so they don't know any of this terminology, etc., and they just asked a simple question trying to understand something, trying to be like, well, so how can you be a non-binary and be femme at the same time? Or how can you be a non-binary woman if you're not binary? Just questions, because they don't understand what I'm talking. Then my defenses would be up strght away. That I'll kind of be like, well, right? So I cringe when I think about it. It's like, what was I doing? I was fighting for people's rights. But that came from, I wrote that because it was a conversation that I was having, a longer conversation that I was having in my life. But I realized that for a lot of people, because we're regurgitating what we've heard, because we're being told what we should say, instead of being encouraged to really think about some of these things and, decide how we want to approach it, what we want to truly say. It just meant that I didn't have a strong argument. I wasn't standing on anything that was actually grounded in common sense, or anything that was grounded in reason, which meant that I, in a way, had to keep my echo chambers even tighter, so that I wouldn't feel that discomfort or to feel that threat, so that I wouldn't be asked any kind of questions. And it was really starting to take from my interactions with people, because on a deep, genuine level, I am someone that likes to be challenged. I am someone that likes to learn. I truly believe that I can learn from pretty much every person that I meet. I won't hunt for a lesson. I'm not one of those people, but there's always something that I can learn, and my brain just works in that way. So when I started to realize that I was actually going against what I do truly value, and I couldn't even argue some of these things that I felt so strongly about. It just started to make less. It never made sense, but I just started to really realize that actually this doesn't make any sense, which is why I speak about things like that quite a lot, as in just work with some of the things that you really take a firm stance on, and some of the things that you find yourself repeating over and over again. Just, flash a light on them and try and figure out what is your actual argument for standing by these things. So yeah, I would say that's where that came from.
Okay, that's interesting. So when we're disagreeing, right? The issue that's become a problem recently is when you disagree on certain issues, right? People will cancel you if they don't like your opinion too much. But the thing is that I hear this on the sort of right side of the political spectrum a lot, that they canceled me because I stated an opinion that they disagree with. But the thing is that the claim is not that you should be cancelled, like not you, but like any person. You should be cancelled because you disagree with me. The claim is that you should be cancelled because your disagreement with me, the opinion that you're stating, is dangerous. It's not just disagreement, it's dangerous disagreement. So we call this, you and I call this cancel culture. Some other people call it cancel culture. But then there are people who may rightly or wrongly point out that this might just be accountability culture. What's wrong with that view? If you think that is wrong.
As in, ultimately, do I believe there is such a thing as accountability culture?
Like, do you think that cancel culture is mostly or mainly just accountability culture? You're being held accountable for what you're saying.
Sure. No, absolutely not. And something that I was thinking about actually yesterday, and I spoke about it in one of my podcast episodes, because someone asked me a question. The question was something along the lines of, how do you deal with people that say cancel culture doesn't exist? And what you're saying right now sort of makes me think of that. And my response was, at a point in time, even a year and a half ago, let's say, especially a year and a half ago, when I really started to understand just how disturbing and how sinister this cancel culture thing really, really was beyond the surface, when I started to realize that it's a huge suicide concern. Like, it's a big time suicide concern. People have no idea of the real world impacts of this thing that we call cancel culture. So especially at that time, if people would have said things like, oh, but it's just accountability, I would have felt so much rage and frustration. And I still feel frustration when I come across people that really seem to stand firm in the fact that either cancel culture doesn't exist or it's just accountability. And it's just, these people in power or bigots or et cetera, that just want to avoid accountability, as if that could be one of the only sensible conclusions. But in really studying the workings of this and wanting to understand, again, the human behavior piece and being more precise in the language that I also use when I refer to this, I realized that it's really difficult to have this conversation because we all define the term cancel culture so differently, so differently. So if we can't even agree on the definition, how can we have the conversation effectively? It's impossible. It's impossible. It's quite frightening, but also here in the West, the word woman, it's become one of those things as well, where people are struggling to really define this word. They're walking on eggshells to try and define this word. So that means we can't have really important conversations that needs to be happening, right? So I don't think it's simply accountability culture. And also, I think it's quite entitled and self-righteous for people to think that they are the ones that get to hold just normal everyday people accountable. Because we're not talking about people in power here. We're talking about the everyday person. For the most part, it's the everyday person that is impacted by this. In the comment section, maybe the comment section or Twitter threads or wherever else they are on social media, maybe they've said something quite ignorant. Maybe something they said or did 5 years ago has resurfaced and it's being put out on the public forum. Maybe they've simply asked a question. Maybe they've accidentally ended up in an echo chamber and they've asked a question that has been deemed, on the list of the unaskable. And they've just asked a question. Now they're just being, jumped on in the comment section. So it's the everyday person that's really impacted by this. So when I think of the term cancel culture, which I refer to personally as collective sabotage, I see cyberbullying, I see antisocial behavior. The moment that I started to really just define what some of the things that I see the cult-like dynamics there as well. The inability to ask questions, punishment as justice, all of those things. It made me really realize that actually this is not about accountability. Maybe the term cancel culture started from a place of holding people in power accountable. I don't know if it was an offshoot of something like Me Too, etc. I can understand that and I can appreciate that because I think these things start from a genuinely good and important place a lot of the time. But we also need to be intellectually honest and admit that it has shifted, that people are not using this for good or for a positive change. So no, I will never buy into the idea that, it's accountability culture, as if you can just throw in another word and it changes what's actually happening, what people can see. So yeah, that's my take on that. What do you think?
I think we must remember the golden rule of punishment, which is that the punishment must fit the crime. So it's like the undisputed rule of punishment, right? You like maybe there are things for which like the kind of cancellation that we see are justified. So things like I don't know, sexual abuse, right? I don't think
Right.
we have like a punishment severe enough to be like to sort of hold a person accountable for that kind of stuff. But it's not people are not being held accountable for things like that. People are being held accountable for, like, quite frankly, quite silly things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think that's my take on that, and that's why I'm not against accountability, because
No.
we're all colleagues in sort of acknowledging that we should hold people accountable. My problem is when people are punished to a point like beyond what the crime that they have committed, right? So I think
Sure.
that's my take on that. Do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I do. I do. It's on the hold people accountable piece. Again, I think that's a term that a lot of us have heard and we kind of know it intuitively, but it's not clearly defined because we're trying to get, if you think about where we're having these conversations, right? On platforms where there are 500 million daily users, right? People coming in and out. It's like rooms, people coming in and out with different experiences, different worldviews, different opinions, language, right? When people say, I'll be completely honest, when people say hold you accountable, hold someone accountable, I'm at a point where I don't even know what the fuck that means. No one even defines, there's no common agreement as to what that actually means. So intuitively, when you say that, I get it. But in actual application, what does that look like? And how can one individual, for example, and I'm not talking here about governments or people in power, etc., because I think that's people are trying to use that as if that's the only way it's being approached, as in it's just corporations, it's states. But this, we're talking about the everyday person. How can one person, if there is an accusation of sexual abuse, let's say, the internet doesn't give you a chance to actually prove whether that is true or not. There have been many people that have been falsely accused, and there have been many people that have actually been perpetrators of the said crime. But you, on the other side, for the most part, you don't have the full details. You don't have the full context. Usually you will have a headline or you'll have something that someone else has said. So how are we, there's no due process on social media. There isn't, which is why I say it's for the most part, it's very maybe entitled. Maybe there can be another word. And please tell me what you think the most fitting word would be. But for me to think that I have the right to hold a stranger accountable online based on something that I've just hopped into and seen without any, I don't have the case notes, I don't have the full details. What right do I have? Which is why I love Jordan Peterson's quote, and I always laugh at this quote. I think he posted it a couple of days ago, paraphrasing, but that if you can't even clean your own room, how can you give advice to the world? It sort of reminds me of that, as in, who am I to get online and hold this person accountable with no details? And I think that's the most frightening part as well, and it links to what I said about a lot of this being a suicide concern, because the amount of venom and the level of attack and punishment that someone will get just from hearsay, or even just someone saying, oh, by the way, this person is a white supremacist. By the way, did you know that you're following a misogynist? By the way, did you know that you're et cetera, right? We're at the point where that is all it takes. So again, it speaks to what you're saying about the punishment not fitting the crime a lot of the time, probably 99% of the time, because there's no room for due process. There's no room for critical thinking to say, actually, no, let me just stand back for a second. What are the full details on this? And even if I have the full details, is it even my place to say anything or to contribute? So yeah, those are my thoughts just on the holding someone accountable piece. it's not clearly defined, and it will look different from person to person. But I think we tend to treat everything as if it's the same, as if just by saying I'm holding them accountable, that means you can bully someone possibly to death.
So perhaps it was my fault because I was not clear enough. So when I say no, like, I do think it was like I was not clear enough. So when I say like we should hold people accountable, what I mean is like they should be held accountable in a court of law, right? And accordingly, because that's where due process happens, right?
Yes.
There you have a fair trial, and after that, once the verdict is out, we act accordingly. If someone is found guilty of sexual abuse, we don't treat that person the exact same way as we treated them before all of this went down. So that's what I meant by that. You did mention Jordan Peterson, and like whenever I do think he's sort of a interesting person, and like I do find his points insightful on a lot of issues. But I do want to mention that quote that you quoted, I suppose, about not who are you to tell, like arrange the world when you've not even cleaned your room. I think there was a debate that Dr. Peterson did with someone I can't pronounce his name, but it's like Slavoj.
I know the
yeah.
one. I know the one. It's a very difficult name to pronounce.
Yeah, I don't know what exactly his name is. If for anyone who's watching, I'll put a link to the debate in the description. But he pointed out that maybe some people try to arrange the worlds without arranging their rooms because their home is in a bad state because of the state of the world. So I thought that was interesting and worth mentioning.
That's good.
Yeah, I thought that it was worth mentioning. But while we're speaking on cancel culture, I do want to mention my own experience with it, basically. So, and this is like getting back to what we discussed at the start. I'm going to tell you why I really started speaking about these matters. So, not recently, a few months ago, 2 months ago, I published a video on my YouTube channel called Why Vegans Must Celebrate Woke Anti-Veganism, right? And when I published that, the people whom I was responding to did not have a response to me, right? So what they did is they sort of, like that person had like 3,000 or so followers on Twitter, and they sort of asked their followers to brigade my channel and report it, right? And so that was interesting because, and while all of this was happening, I don't know if you saw the updates that I was posting on Instagram, but racial slurs were not off limits, right? And like this was basically a sort of bunch of Westerners ganging up on me. And they did not like that when I called them Westerners because the person whom I was responding to, whom I think I responded to quite politely, is Native American. And right, so when I call them Westerners, because of this Western-Centrism that is going on in our world, people don't like that. Like this, like we are not Westerners. So that was very interesting to me. And like, and how it arrived to this point, right, is when people advocate for veganism. I have a few friends who are, one of my friends is a straight, white, cis male. And he's also British, right? It's not as if he's Polish or like a marginalized white person. No, he's British white. So like whenever he speaks on these issues, right, he's told, listen, you're a white person. Don't speak about this. If you say anything to us about our practices, that is colonialist, that is racist, right? So yeah, that happens a lot. And this is actually what caused me to start speaking up. Right? I make videos on veganism, and they are told, right, don't speak about these issues because you're white. So I'm like, okay, you won't listen to them, listen to me, right? Because I'm not white, right?
Yeah.
And the interesting, I suppose, something that people might find interesting about me is that it's very obvious that I am what Westerners would call a person of color, which is like a bit of a funny term. But even within
Can I ask, do you use that term in
No.
India?
No,
Of
it's
course not,
ridiculous.
because it's stupid. Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to get into the details of that later. But yeah, I'm a person of color, as they would call me. But I'm also not just like any person of color, right? I'm not a Westerner. So that I belong to a marginalized section within this marginalized section of society, right? I'm from a developing country. But I'm also not any kind of person from a developing country. Within India, of course, is not a homogeneous place.
Yeah.
There is a region of India which is marginalized, and many people, myself included, would say that there is neocolonialism in this part of India. I belong to that part of India, right? So I am the marginalized within the marginalized within the marginalized, as they would have it. But I'm also not any kind of Northeast Indian. I'm belong to a sort of marginalized tribe within the Northeast. So I know this is getting a bit funny. But yeah, so according to their sort of worldview, I have this lot of lot of wokeness points, I suppose. Right?
As in, you can kind of go and tick right.
Right. So I'm saying look, here's what I have to say on this issue. And when I do that, that's not comfortable for them. Right? When I say look, veganism is a moral obligation, it's not colonialist, it's not racist, they're like, no, it is. And you've just internalized your oppression, right? You've internalized the colonialism. And that's where that's what caused me to speak on this issue. Right. And that's because it hinders on the message that I'm trying to get out to people.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I before we because I do think that I just speak a lot right now, I just want to get your reaction to that. Does that because I do know that veganism is perceived as this far left, non-rational, emotional rage kind of thing. I do want to know if that changed your perception, or what do you think of that whole fiasco?
I think just hearing it, because of course I'm still processing it, and it will be something that I just sit with even after this conversation. It's not something that I have thought about too much, as in how some of these things might present themselves in the vegan space, for example. But it kind of speaks to something that I'm already familiar with, and something that also drives me to speak in the way that I do, where people will, to put it very simply, they don't know what to do with you. They don't know what to do with you because they don't know where to place you, because it would be much easier for them to know how to respond to you if you were born in the West and you were a wealthy Indian person that is born and raised in the West. Then that would make it so easy for them. But you're not. Again, as you said, you tick all of those identity boxes that are required for you to be treated as a king, But at the same time, you are completely going against what they have told themselves is to be expected. And they just don't know what to do with you. So it's just hearing that again, I find it's actually very telling that I don't even find that shocking. Even find that shocking what you're sharing with me, because I've just become so used to hearing that, regardless of what the space is, regardless of whether it's in veganism, regardless of whether it's in the gender space, regardless of whether it's in other areas. But it just speaks to how many people have really bought into this idea that people of color, and I think that term also has something to do with it, that people of color are monolithic regardless of where they might be in the world. It's almost as if there's no consideration of where they might be in the world. The assumption is that you're in North America usually, which is just so bizarre, that regardless of where you are regardless of where you are on the internet, people will assume that you're in North America. Even with me, that happens sometimes, which again just shows you that Western-centric mindset. But it's my goodness. But this is what I love about you and your work and where you are in the world, that you're contributing to this conversation in such a unique way. And no one can take that away from you. Because again, as I was saying, if your location was slightly different and you were here in the US, I think most people might not feel as inclined to listen to what you have to say. But I think just your geographical location allows for you to be a part of this conversation in a way that actually makes people stop and listen and reminds them that there is a world beyond the Anglosphere, which I think is really important. And it reminds me a little bit of my own experience, which is that because of the way that I speak, and because of where I am, people will just assume that I was born and raised here. But no, I'm an immigrant. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. Shona is my first language. I grew up in a very different world. I know what oppression looks like, which is why I reject it in association with myself. Because as I've said, I think that's a slap in the face of people that are truly, truly struggling. So I think what makes people have to work with their own cognitive dissonance is the fact that I wasn't born and raised in this country. I wasn't born into wealth. I wasn't even university educated. And so it sort of makes people have to understand that I'm not just approaching this conversation from a place of a British person that was just born into luxury, and this is why she says that she's not oppressed, you know? So yeah, I think it's really important to have voices like you and I, because we offer something that jolts people out of their sort of trance. So I think it's important.
So I don't want to give a free pass to the sort of anti-woke cult, I suppose, because they are like all the time. They are like, we should seek out disagreement. You know, we should be willing to have difficult conversations. This is the sort of mantra on that side, which is, I suppose, a good mantra, right? But try having a conversation with them about animal rights, right? And then you've gone too far. Now you're forcing your opinion on them.
I've seen this.
Who is forcing your opinion? Like, who is forcing their opinion on you? We're just asking a question. Right. And this is, I think, where they sort of mirror each other, like very strongly, because being in this space, being in this sort of looking at this through this lens of animal rights, I'm seeing that like they really do mirror each other. Like the mirroring is also seen in how they engage in name calling, right? As you mentioned earlier, right? So these sort of anti-woke people would call me like a woke SJW, or an extremist, or that kind of stuff. And on the other side, I'm told I'm a colonialist, which is very interesting because I'm like, because I'm on native land, right? I'm in India. I'm considered an indigenous tribal person. To call me a colonialist is quite bizarre. And even if it was true that I was like a settler into the West, what does that have to do with the validity of my arguments? Nothing.
Right.
Nothing. But it's not even true.
No connection.
No connection. So another name calling that would be involved is like, because veganism it's about individual action. Like a lot of the time, it's not just about that. It's about like, you know, you should stop contributing to this, which is like you should like stop your funding to this industry. Right. It's about voting with your dollars, sort of. People tell me I'm a capitalist. Right, because I'm focusing too much on individual change. So there's this mirroring, I suppose. But yeah, so I do see this sort of mirroring. But before we proceed, I want to know if you have anything to say to that.
No, I think for that part, it's more so just me again listening. But I mean, I said this earlier on in our conversation, but I really do see the exact same behavior from different sides, and it's something that I'm so wary of now. And you know what? I think here's the thing. This might be a slight deviation, or maybe not, or you might resonate with this, or maybe not. But with the work that I do, I've been sharing and speaking publicly and exploring different things for the past 5 years. And even if it wasn't for the past 5 years, even if everything had started from the letter that I wrote, for example, I'm in this for the long haul. I'm not in this for fame. I couldn't give a shit about that, honestly. I could not give a shit. I'm not in this for followers. I'm not in this for some kind of gain. The reality and truth is that actually, because I'm not focused on those things, because I'm just deeply committed to just good work and having conversations, all of those things just end up being a result and have been for the past however long. But I'm in this for the long haul. I'm not in this to be part of any kind of clique. Which is why I hold so much pride in how I use my voice and in how intentional I am with the messages that I decide to put out. I am not the kind of person that will hop onto the latest thing that's happening online, feel like I need to be some sort of political, social commentator. That is just not me, not my approach. I take a lot of time where I just sit back and I do my work and I write and I have conversations with people to really understand this. So from the beginning, this is me kind of repeating myself, but it's very important. From the beginning, I was very, very intentional and mindful about not just hopping into another group of people that are having these conversations, because I quickly realized that it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing, especially the name calling, the self-righteousness, the sort of laughing because they're less evolved, they're less awakened. You see it, it's the same shit all the time, which is why one of the most important posts that I wrote was the one where I said, paraphrasing my own words, but where I said, I'm not woke or anti-woke, or I don't give a shit if you're woke or anti-woke, and really address the things that I genuinely have an issue with. Because the key to all of this, I really do believe it's not just communication, but it's the language that we choose to use. And I think the more precise that you are with your language, that's why instead of people just saying, oh, the wokes, even when I speak to some of my friends, we check each other on things like that, or I check them on things like that and say, actually, what do you actually mean? What are you really trying to say? So that you can really start to use richer communication, because it's less divisive. And I think my work does really well because it speaks to you regardless of where you sit. It's not, because our lives have been so heavily politicized, it's easy to read it through a political lens, and that's fine, but that's not its purpose. It doesn't just speak to the left or to the right. It speaks to so many different types of people who are just noticing there's an issue. And I think it's really possible to do that even in your daily lives and conversations, if you just use more precise language instead of saying, cancel culture, which anyone can say whatever they want. What are you really trying to say? What are you actually seeing? Is it that antisocial behavior? Is it the cyberbullying? Is it other things? Is it narcissism? Because collective narcissism is a very real thing. And I think that's also happening. So I think when we are more precise with our language, it's easier to actually work towards what we want to work towards, whatever that might be. But I think the self-proclaimed anti-woke people are very far removed from that, because I don't think that's actually their goal. Sometimes the goal is to, if I'm just being honest, to feed this new brand that they're creating, or to get more of a following, to build a personality of sorts. And I really don't think it's useful. Even as I say that out loud, my skin crawls a little bit, because it just, to me, defies the entire point of conversations like this.
Interesting. So, Africa, I've rambled on about veganism for a while. I'm assuming you've never quite thought about that issue too much. Like, am I correct in that assumption?
You are correct. And is this where you convert me? Is this what this whole podcast was about?
This is where I try to challenge you on this issue.
Sure.
So you've like within your letter, right? You said you speak, you stand for human rights, right? And you stand for all, not just for people who share your skin color or your gender. You stand for all. But
for
the
all
issue
human
that
rights,
yes, for everyone, right? But the issue that I'm seeing there is that you are limiting yourself. You're limiting your moral community to just human beings. So we speak about human rights, right? But what is the ethical basis for human rights, right? We say that, human rights, everyone gets it, like gets those rights, regardless of their race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. But why? It's because these things are not morally relevant, right? These are differences that we have, but these are not morally relevant differences. So we recognize the differences, but we recognize that they're not morally relevant differences. So just as being non-racist, not anti-racist, just as being non-racist encompasses recognizing the difference, but recognizing that there are morally irrelevant differences, so too does the refusal of participating in the exploitation of animals encompass that recognizing that we're very different, right? A pig is very different to a human being, who is very different to a chicken, and so forth. So if we say that, this is the thing that gives human beings the moral value, that moral value, we'll have to name that trait. So if we say something like, we value human beings because they are intelligent, right? Because they have a certain level of intelligence, which a lot of people say, right? So the logic would have to work as such. If you say that that is the trait that gives human beings moral value, then it follows from your own reasoning that if we found a human being who lacks that trait, who is not as intelligent, who, because of some severe mental disability, has the intelligence level of a pig, that we would be justified to kill that human being. But that is a bizarre conclusion. So we have reached a bizarre conclusion, that must mean that our logic, that our premise, that intelligence is what gives someone moral worth, must be wrong, right? So, and another point that I want to press here is that this is not about human beings versus pigs, right? This is about the temporary taste pleasure of human beings versus the life and liberty of pigs, of chickens and goats and so on, right? So, so that's the point that I want to make, because there is sort of we must recognize our place, because this is scientific reality, that we are not the unrestricted owner of animals, but an animal ourselves, right? Human beings are animals, right? So that's the thing, right? That that's the basis on which I say that we must not contribute to unnecessary suffering. I'd just like to get your take on that.
I don't know if I have a take. I don't think I have a take on that. And I'm always very honest if I don't have anything useful to contribute to something, because especially when it comes to a topic like veganism, it's not something that I've ever really seriously considered. I think I tried it for maybe a few weeks, couple of years ago. But it was not a sort of moralistic decision. It wasn't because I was really intensely thinking about animals or anything like that. It was more so just a very surface level personal challenge. And I think for the most part of my life, I've just been focused on other things. And it's just not one of the things that has been at the forefront. Is it something that I would like to just find out more about? And to be honest, I've seen a few documentaries and still have not made the decision to go vegan. I just don't think it's something that I really committed to, even intellectually, to really understand. So I don't have any kind of hot take or any sort of disagreement or anything to offer up. I just think it's very interesting what you're putting forward. And I'm always open to listening, to understanding. But yeah, no, I'm not a vegan. No.
Right. So the thing is that you are not neutral on this issue, right? You are contributing to it. Right?
Okay,
so
I'm contributing to it, yes.
Yeah, you're contributing to unnecessary suffering. So
yes.
if you've not thought about it, because I've always viewed it as this, because if someone has never thought about racism, right? The default position is not to contribute to racism. The default position is also not to be an anti-racist. The default position is to be a non-racist. So at the moment, you're not an animal rights activist, which I don't expect you to be. I'm not asking you to be. But you're also not neutral. You've chosen a side here, which is to pay for their suffering. So given that you're doing that, given that you're causing suffering,
Right.
right? Whenever we cause suffering, we justify it. So if a country decides to go on a war, they provide some kind of a justification for it. And
Yes.
maybe the justification is valid, maybe it's not. But they must be the ones to provide the justification. So in this case, what is your justification for contributing to this unnecessary suffering?
I don't think there's one that I can put forward right now. I actually think this is something that actually requires me to think about properly, not on the spot with the microphone in front of my face, because I think it would cheapen it in the sense that just for the case of this recording, I would have to think of something to present to you, and it might not actually be an honest truth. Because it's not something that I've thought about, like many other things that exist in the world that maybe you haven't thought about, that you might be directly or indirectly contributing to. It's not something that I've thought about. And I don't like to force myself to have to come up with something that's actually really important for me to sit with, for me to have to change my worldview, for me to actually sit with the discomfort that I feel and will feel when I really think about this in a different way. So there's nothing that I can contribute in terms of having a back and forth on this, because I think it actually deserves more time and more focus and me really understanding what I'm talking about. Yeah. But I do appreciate you putting that forward, because when I talk about honoring discomfort, even in the work that I do, it's not just this fucking fluffy thing that we say, and then when it happens, you're like, we get defensive and we want to shut it down. When I can feel discomfort in my body, especially hearing you saying, but you're contributing to suffering and it actually is a choice. The reality is that it is. It's not as if I don't have, especially when I think of the access that I have here in the Western world in general, the amount of options that I have to not have to eat meat. It's a very conscious choice. It's not as if I'm being forced to do it, or that I'm a child that has been raised in a family, even though culturally in the family that I was raised in, we just ate meat. It just was. You step into something that's already existing. But then when you do become conscious and an adult, you do have a choice. And I am an adult that has a choice, and I choose to consciously eat it. So hearing that being reflected back and feeling that discomfort and having to feel it and to actually think about it, I think it's a very important thing. And again, as I said, I'm just not the kind of person that will just flick an answer back to, it's something that I would think about. And when I do, I'll send you a voice note and maybe we can continue this conversation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I do appreciate your honesty, right?
Yeah.
But before we talk about other things, I'd just like to make something very clear that since you do contribute to this unnecessary industry of unimaginable suffering, the kind of suffering that we cannot even imagine. I hate what you do, but I don't hate you, right? I think highly enough of you to know that you too are capable of reaching this moral standard, right? That's why I'm trying to have this conversation with you. If I thought that I was morally superior to you, that I'm superior to Africa Brooke, she just won't get it, why would I ever try to have this conversation with you? I'd try to have that conversation with someone else or just keep it to myself. It's because I respect you. It's because I respect you that I try to have this conversation with you. So before we go on to another topic, I'd just like to leave you with that question about what is that trait that gives human beings moral worth, right? And maybe you don't have to answer it right now.
Sure. I'm listening and processing in real time.
What is that trait that gives human beings moral worth? Whatever trait you think it is. The reasoning is that since you've said that is the trait that gives someone moral value, if we find a human being who lacks that trait, we would be justified to torture and kill that human being for our sensory pleasure, right? So if you'd be comfortable with torturing and killing a human being like that, then you're justified to contribute to this unnecessary suffering.
Right.
But otherwise, you're left with the uncomfortable conclusion that this must end and this must end now, right? And I really do appreciate
that's really worth Yeah, that one just, you might have just done something there. Wow. I've never, you know what it is? I've never obviously consciously thought about that, but I know a lot of vegan people, but I've never heard it articulated in such a way. And undoubtedly, this is something that I'm going to be thinking about. I will not allow my ego to sort of push it out of the way, as in, who are you to try and tell me any of this? I'm very open. And I see you share things like this sometimes, but I think there's something about hearing someone that you do respect, as I respect you, which is why we're having this conversation, put something forward like that. And I actually appreciate the conviction and the commitment that you have. But yeah, that's worth thinking about. I'll be sitting with that for a while.
That's good.
Yeah.
So people don't generally. This is not the kind of reaction that I'm used to, right? People will just dodge the question. They will avoid the question. They'll just strawman the question. Consider someone like Sam Harris. When he's asked this question, he just answers a completely different question. You ask him, why are you contributing to this? He goes on to explain why human beings have greater moral worth than pigs. But that's not the question we're asking. We're asking, why do human taste pleasure have more importance than like the lives of pigs, right? And sometimes he'll say something like I'm just not healthy, like I couldn't manage to be healthy on a vegan diet. Are we seriously expected to believe that someone with the wealth and intelligence of Sam Harris cannot manage to find a proper way to be healthy on a vegan diet when I can, when so many people
the options
far
are
less
endless.
Yes, and he's a millionaire, right? This is not the kind of reaction I'm used to. So, yeah, it's a fresh change that I was not expecting this. So yeah, it's a good.
Good.
It's a good experience.
And of course, if you can send me anything that's worth looking at or reading, I would really just, I'd really like to understand, so that I can actually really think about this, because I think it is quite uncomfortable, especially if the person does believe themselves to be someone who is morally in tune, whatever that means. I think that's when the ego can come up really strong. And I can imagine with people like Sam Harris, who's also a very intellectual person, it's very easy to intellectualize your way out of it. But I just prefer to be honest. And I think some things, it's not worth me trying to curate some sort of answer or to push back when I haven't actually thought about it. And it's something that's worth thinking about. And at the same time, I think it's also dependent on the person that is putting forward the question and how they're doing that. Because maybe my response would have felt different if I had, or even a part of me had assumed that you're trying to belittle me, or that you brought me into this conversation under false pretenses to sort of just bring something forward that I didn't expect or didn't know we were going to speak about. Or if you're coming at it from a self-righteous place, or you're trying and forcing to get a particular response out of me, then maybe the response would have been different. Maybe I would have picked up on something like that. But I'm just generally open to understanding. So yeah.
So, well, I'd just like to talk about something that you and I might have a unique take on, I suppose, or an interesting take on at least. It's about Western-Centrism. So as I just advocated or made the case for veganism to you, right? I do this it goes out as a general message, right? And like people will usually say, like, you know, as I've already told you, people will say that, you know, you're a settler, you don't get to tell Native American people what they must do. But I'm not telling anyone that. I just like to know, why do you think people in the West, have this notion that, or this subconscious notion that, you know, the Western world is all that exists? Because I've come across it a lot, and I've tried to think about it. I just can't seem to understand why they do it. Have you?
Me neither. Me neither. You know what? This is something that I've been thinking about now more than ever, to really just understand what is going on. And I can't seem to put my finger on it in a concise and articulate way. But I wonder if it's just because of how influential the US is, especially that anything that is happening in the US, because of the Anglosphere. So I believe that is the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. Anything that happens in the US, even socially, just sort of spills over into the Anglosphere, and it's just taken hook, line, and sinker. It's just taken as if this is just the absolute truth for everyone that is in the West, regardless of what ethnicity you are, your culture, regardless of whether you're an immigrant or not. Those nuances are completely just sort of scrapped. But I think that's my starting point. It's not something that I've really, really explored. And I speak to different people, and no one seems to know exactly what it is. But again, my own weapon for this, if you will, which is weaved into my work, is just constantly reminding people where I can that I wasn't born and raised here, that I'm from a very specific culture in Southern Africa, that I remember everything that was around me when I was growing up. I have something to compare my Western experience to. And also in my household, yes, we are in the West, but it's very much Zimbabwe when I'm in my household. Still speak Shona is my first language. So when I introduce all of those things into my work and my message, which is why I appreciate when you do similar things yourself, I think it just helps to break down even maybe my own sort of Western way of thinking that I'm not aware of. So yeah, so I don't have a kind of clean cut answer to that because I think it's such a complex thing, but it's fucking annoying. I'll tell you that much. It's yeah.
Another thing that Westerners do, right? As we touched upon earlier, is that they will refer to people like myself and yourself as POC.
Right.
When I first heard that term, right? It was a friend of mine, like internet friend sort of, who told me that you're considered a POC. I thought they were making a racist joke, right? Because I do know that colored person is a racial slur.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right. And
even though in South Africa, colored is actually the word for mixed race. So if you're mixed race, you're just called colored. That's just how it is. So it's just interesting how language works depending on where you are. But yeah.
Right. So they said you're considered a person of color, and then I was like, and we had that conversation. It's not like I attacked them directly, but my initial reaction was this person is making a racist joke at me.
Right.
And I was like, at the end of it, I was like, okay, if I'm a person of color, what are you then? Are you a transparent person? So I just like to know how, because the term person of color just implies transparent people. So I just want
that's hilarious actually.
I just want to know how if being in because you grew up in Zimbabwe and then you moved to the West, what is how do you process that term, because it still rubs me the wrong way. I don't much care if someone says that person is a colored person or that person is a person of color. I don't much care, but I do see those as equal. I do care about their intentions.
Yes.
If they're saying it to be racist, then it's a problem, regardless of what you're calling me. But if that's not their intention, then I just don't care. I want to know how you process, how that process in your mind.
It's such a bizarre term, and it's fairly new in the sense that it mainly started to get used, I would say maybe even 4 to 5 years ago is when even 5 years ago, I don't think that term was being used much at all. So I think it's still on a wide mainstream scale, from my knowledge. I just think it's, again, one of those things that just does not make sense, because if we have decided that colored person in the North American sense and in the West in general is a no-go, that colored person is racist because of the context, the historical context, and in its use, it's racist, right? What's what actually really is the difference between colored person and people of color, instead of just changing around words and adding an off and swapping the, what is actually the right? What is actually the difference? The answer is there is no difference. There's no, some of these things are not even founded on just common sense. And also, I think a lot of these terms perpetuate the very thing that people are claiming to be fighting against, which is white supremacy, because what you're doing is that you're putting everyone else, you're putting white people here as the default, and then everyone else, the other billions of people, regardless of where they are in the world, they fit into this other one group. So it's just this, like, when you really think about that, that's so strange. But it seems like, which gives me a bit of hope. There are people that are starting to push back a little bit on this term, because they're starting to realize that actually it doesn't really make sense, and it just positions white people as the default. That we've kind of fucked up here. Let's have a meeting and talk about this, right? I think people should do that. But I think it's just so bizarre. Nothing like that exists in Zimbabwe. But of course, you could argue that's because it is a majority Black country. So maybe language like that isn't really necessary. But I would also argue that here in the West, language like that is not really necessary to group so many ethnicities and races in one box, because I think that also fuels the stereotypes that we have, this idea that we're all sharing the exact same experience, this idea that we're all oppressed by default, the idea that if one person is not thinking the same as everyone else, then they must have some kind of internalized disease. So I think we need to really evaluate this language. I think it's much better to be more precise. If you're speaking about a Black person, if you're speaking about an Asian person, are you speaking about a Persian person? So I think there are ways, again, to be more precise with our language instead of looking for the quick and cheap way out. But to me, person of color is racist. That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I suppose we should provide an alternative for the term. And here in India, people tend to think of India as this homogeneous place. But here in India, we do have something analogous, and it's just racial minorities, right? You want to say like someone, like, because they're in like the minority, they're oppressed. If you just want to talk about that group collectively, for some reason, it might be useful. You just say racial minorities. I think that is a useful.
Yeah.
I think that's a useful
more
term.
Precise. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do want to mention this briefly because like you mentioned that that people tend to think of the rest of the world as one group. To me, that was never my experience growing up. To myself, I am a Coach Rajbangshi person, right? And like people will say to me, like, whenever I'm like, if I say anything about, let's say, Jewish people, for example, not say anything about them, if I mention it for some reason, right, that like Jewish Holocaust, for example, like how they suffered during in Nazi Germany. If I say just fit the script, sort of, then they will be like, how dare you say this about like Jewish people? Don't you know there are like a few million Jewish people in the world, and and you are like 1 billion people, right? You're Indian, but I'm like, Indian is not my ethnicity. Right. Indian is my nationality, right? My ethnicity is Coach Rajbangshi, and there are even fewer Coach Rajbangshi people. And so, I thought that this was like worth mentioning.
Yeah, that is, again, even it offers me even more perspective, even if it's just understanding you a little bit more. But for the listener, I'm sure, to just really think beyond some of these very limiting terms that we use to sort of just capture billions of experiences in one, because it's just not that simple. It's the oversimplification of some of these things that I find really, really concerning, actually. So I do think that was useful to put forward.
So we've crossed the 1.5 hour mark, like 8 minutes ago. This was like a very interesting and very insightful conversation. Before we wrap up, do you have anything that you'd like to talk about or mention?
No, nothing at all. Although I will make an invitation for anyone that has any thoughts on some of the things that we've spoken about. I'm doing a lot of research at the moment on just understanding some of the dynamics that are playing out socially. I am in the process of writing a book. It's still in its very early stages, but really understanding how self-censorship works, the cost of self-censorship, how people can actually start to move into what I refer to as mindful speech, because it's not an either or. It's not just about censoring yourself or saying whatever the fuck you want. There really is that genuine middle ground. So I'm doing a lot of research and just speaking to different people, seeing what they actually think. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me on social media. And I'd just like to know what you think and what resonates. So yeah, that's my only ask.
Right. And like before we wrap this up, like can you just briefly mention where people can find you?
Yes. My only social media is Instagram. So you can find me at Africa Brooke with an E at the end. And I have a podcast, which is called Beyond the Self. And it's all about focusing on what you can control. And I dive into a lot of topics such as self-censorship, such as imposter syndrome. I talk about things like limiting beliefs, but from a very evidence-based point of view, instead of, the surface level self-helpy type thing. So my podcast, you can find a lot of my work there, and to just get a bit of an understanding of how I approach some of these conversations in a non-divisive way. And I also have a website, which is africabrooke.com.
I will, to the listener, I will link all of those in the description box if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on any of your favorite podcast platforms, those will be in the show notes. So do find Africa Brooke and follow her, because she is incredibly insightful, as you must have realized during this conversation. So Africa, I think we can wrap up there. It was nice having you on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I look forward to maybe doing this again, maybe in the next year or so, when I have more insights to sort of offer some of the things we've spoken about. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. The pleasure is mine. Anyway, to my viewers, please note that this podcast is made possible by your support on Patreon. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Soytheist. And I'll see you in the next one.